While other Archicad tutorial videos attempt to show you really cool things that you can do with the software, this video, on the other hand, I'm going to show you some really boring stuff and geek out like crazy on properties. Alright, welcome back to the Colorblind Architect Does Archicad, and today's tutorial video, I'm going to take something that typically you have to do manually and try to automate it, and that's performing code calculations. So I don't know about other countries, but in the United States we use the International Building Code, and the International Building Code, there's a particular way in which you need to calculate your occupancy and your required plumbing fixtures. So today I'm going to go over briefly how I use zones and the properties that I can attach to those zones to calculate the required plumbing fixtures and the occupancy for the building. Now obviously, depending on the building, you might have a bunch of different spaces. For example, in a casino in Vegas, for example, you might have a hotel, which is going to be one occupancy. Then you're going to have the casino section, which is going to be another occupancy. You're going to have the food court, which is another occupancy type. And of course, you're going to have auditoriums and wedding chapels and all kinds of stuff in these massive buildings. Now, even on a smaller building, you might have multiple spaces. For example, let's say it's a church building, and that church building might have it might have a chapel, which is going to have the assembly spaces, but then it might also have classrooms, which are going to be an educational occupancy. And then it might also even have a kitchen, because some churches like to serve food. So it's important to be able to calculate your occupancy based on the different spaces. Now, if you're looking at the screen, you can see I've got a schedule that I've created. There are actually two schedules I'll be showing. The first one is this occupancy and load schedule, and this basically just breaks down the spaces that I have, or the zones. These zones are I haven't even drawn up a building necessarily, I've just put in these zones. Within these zones, they then have properties. Now, if you remember my video on keynotes, you go to Options, Property Manager, and under Zones, I've added a bunch of parameters or properties for occupancy and various plumbing factors. We'll get to that a little bit later. As a result, those populate this, and in that we can fill out various fields and get an automated number. Now, on the plumbing fixture schedule, you can see we've got the occupant function based on table 1004 in chapter 10 of the IBC, the load factors, and then you can see the occupants, and then we can also divide up those occupants into male and female. And then as we go further, we get into our water closet calculations, along with code requirements, the number required as calculated based on these code requirements, and the number of occupants, and also the provided, which is something that currently have set to just be manual, so you do have to manually count your fixtures. You could theoretically put in an actual measurement of these, but to simplify things and also allow some manual repair of the schedule, I've left those as something that you manually enter. Lavatories, same thing, calculated based on the code requirements, and then you manually enter in the number provided. And then showers, drinking fountains, and this is all based on the chapter 29 of the IBC, the required plumbing fixtures. So how did I create this? And why would you want to use this? Well, obviously you don't necessarily have to, and this does, I might add, require a good bit of setup on the beginning. So let's get into it. How do you set this up? Well, as I said, you're going to create properties, and so options, property manager, and under zones you're going to first you need to have an occupant function, and this is just a simple option set. So the occupant function is based on the table 1004 that I mentioned, and it's basically just all of those functions. So whether it's agricultural building, courtrooms, dormitories, you just list these out as an option set. Now, one little helpful hint is you can actually copy and paste each of these into a text file separately so that you can get back to these easier as you're filling out the next property, which would be occupant load. Now, in your occupant load, this one is going to be an integer. And the reason for this is the occupant load is a load factor, and it's based on a particular number per square foot typically. And so we're going to set the data type to integer. And by the way, on all of these, make sure you're clicking all on your availability. It just makes it a lot easier because then you can click on your zone and make sure that it's got these property sets added. Now, under the value definition, integer, you're going to choose expression. Now, for the expression, here's where it gets a little bit complicated. Now, I've already built this because it takes a long time to set these up. So, and if you're interested, reach out to me in the comments. I might be able to connect with you later and maybe post these later. I have to think about how to share this information, because I don't want to share my template in its fullness, because there's a lot of time and proprietary information in there, but I am willing to share this methodology. So this particular expression, you click on edit, and as you can see, it's a pretty long expression. This expression uses the ifs formula. So under that, you choose the formula, logical functions, and it's ifs. Ifs is basically where you have multiple options that you want to apply a value to. So in this case, each ifs statement is going to have the logical condition. In this case, it would be occupant function, which is the parameter that we created the option set before, equals whatever the name of that occupant function was that we set in the list, and then the value. The value is the actual load factor. In this case, you can see we've got ifs, then parentheses, occupant function, and it's highlighted because it is coming from this property here, equals, and then you have to put this section in quotes, okay, because the occupant function is a string and it has a text value. You need to make sure this is the exact same text. So quote, and then the exact text, unquote, comma, and then the actual value. In this case, for accessory storage areas, the load factor is 300, or in other words, 300 square feet per person. Now, repeat that for all those spaces, all those types of spaces, including skating rinks, library reading rooms. I did this for everything because I'm saving this into my template. That way, I can use it on every project without having to add. Now make sure at the bottom, for example, if I add that 2 at the end, you see syntax error in expression. So make sure you clean up the expression so it just basically repeats, so the condition, then the value, comma. So condition, comma, value, comma, condition 2, comma, value 2, comma, and so forth. You just keep on adding them, and so for each condition there is an equated value. We're going to use this again on other properties. Now once you have this, you will also need to create an occupant count. So the occupant count is an expression, again, Very similar to the prior, this one's going to be an integer and an expression. We also do need to make sure that we have this available to all our objects. And this particular expression is a much simpler one. It's rounding up. And the reason is obviously we don't want to have like a half person. We need to count this as a whole person. And so round up, and then string to number, string calc unit, measured area divided by occupant load, and there's one other factor in there. You can look up each of these functions to see what they mean. This 0 is part of the roundup formula, which basically is saying we don't want any decimal points. It's going to round up to the whole integer, not a decimal point. So what that will do is calculate for each occupancy type what the number of people in that occupancy type for that zone is. Now, male and female occupants, this is based on another simple formula. Each of them are identical, but we need to have two separate ones just in case. So some buildings you may not want to have an exact equal distribution of males and females. For example, once I designed a Muslim mosque. In this mosque, there are significantly more males attending than females. For a variety of reasons. This was a direction from the imam that was hiring me to perform this work. Now, in this case, you would want to manually put in a different value. And there is a place for this. I'll show you that later. Now, once you've got your male and female occupants, you're also going to need to set up your strings. Now, the required strings, or the code requirements that I showed you, the way those work is that's a pure text-to-text translation. So, if you remember, we have the occupant function. That occupant function, well, defines the number of people. Now, in the IBC, there's a separate function for the occupancy that defines the number of people from the plumbing occupancy type. Now, the plumbing occupancy type determines how to calculate the number of fixtures. So, in this case, I have a separate property for plumbing occupancy type. And this is another option set where I have gone through and just listed all the Chapter 29 categories. Regardless of whether I'm ever going to use them on a project, I went ahead and put the entire chapter into there. And then in each of these water closets required string, lavatory required string, and so forth, it is a string parameter with an expression, and then that expression is another if statement where the plumbing occupancy type equals, and then the exact text in quotes of the plumbing occupancy type that I've put into the plumbing occupancy option set, comma, and then in quotes the text string of what I want to display, which is exactly the code requirements for that specific occupancy type. In this case, assembly theaters and other buildings for the performing arts and motion pictures, the code requirement is male would be 1 per 125 and female 1 per 65. As you might note, female and male toilet rooms have several occupancies, largely because there are differences between the sexes, and typically females require more toilets to be able to have an equal access to water closets than males, because males can use urinals and it's a lot quicker. So let's move on to where it gets a little bit more complicated. So once you get all those done, you'll click OK, and now it's time to actually do the calculations. Now, the number of required water closets for a female on these different occupancies is in this parameter. And the way I've set this up, you've got a number and it's defined by an expression. Now note I used number because with these, what I don't want is I don't want to round up, I don't want to have whole numbers, and the reason why is because occasionally you're going to have multiple spaces of the same type that can actually share the same restroom facilities. And so what I've opted to do is to go to the hundredths place with the number and be able to calculate it in partial numbers. That way I can see if I have a need for 7.58 toilets, I can know, okay, I need to provide 8. Whereas if I was to have every zone calculated to the whole number, I could theoretically have a requirement for 15 toilets because each one would round up and then add. And so we don't want to do that. We want to be able to know what the actual calculation is, and then we'll manually figure out from there, okay, if it's 7.58, I know I need 8. Now, in this case, the expression, this one is even more complicated than the prior ones, and it takes a while to set these up. But it is well worth your time because you do it once, you save it into your template, and you get to use this on all your projects. So this is another if statement, and in this case, it also draws from the plumbing occupancy type. That plumbing occupancy type equals, quote, the text of that plumbing occupancy type from the list, and then, comma, your value. In this case, for the assembly theaters and other buildings for the performing arts and motion pictures, if you remember, it was for females, it was 1 per 65. So in this case, we would use the female occupancy property divided by 65, and that will give us the number. Now, where you have some plumbing fixture requirements, for example, in business occupancies, it's 1 per 25 for the first 50, and 1 per 50 for the remaining exceeding 50. Now, that's a more complicated calculation, so here's how you do this. So we get here into this section of the ifs expression, where we have plumbing occupancy type equals, quote, buildings for the transaction of business, professional services, or other services involving merchandise, office buildings, banks, light industrial, ambulatory care, and similar uses, unquote, comma, and then we put an if statement. Now, if statement is slightly different than an if statement. An if statement is if condition is true, then value when true, comma, value when false. So in this case, if the female occupancy is less than 50, then in the true case, it would just be female occupants divided by 25. Versus if it's more than 50, the female occupants minus 50, so that we take out that first 50 that's calculated 1 per 25. Then we divide those by 50. Then we add the 2 back in from the 1 per 25 for the first 50. So that math formula then will result in the proper calculation being done for this zone to make sure that we have the proper number of toilet fixtures calculated for that particular occupancy type. Now repeat this throughout the entire code and you end up with this really long expression, but here's the great thing, it works. Now, in some of these cases, you'll have plumbing fixtures that are defined by unit or by sleeping unit or by dwelling unit. In those cases, I either put 1 or 0 based on what it is, and then I'll just need to know that on those particular occupancy types, I might have to create a custom answer within the schedule. And there, like I said, it's a pretty easy way to do it. Now, once I have all these properties set up properly, I can go in and set up the schedule. Now, within the schedule, I've already set this element type to zone, and related zone category is occupancy and occupant load. Now, I've created a specific zone category for this. The reason for this is a lot of times you'll have a bunch of rooms that are all part of the same occupant category, and for the purposes of the code analysis, I don't necessarily want to use the same zones for the rooms as I do for the code analysis, largely because it's not a one-to-one. Sometimes your zoning analysis, your code analysis, is going to need to be for a whole building or a whole section of the building, including the wall thicknesses, or even if you don't include the wall thicknesses. So I leave this as a separate category, and that way, as I'm going through, I can make sure that it's only those that are being calculated in this plumbing calculation, and the room numbers for the room zones, completely unrelated. It's a separate calculation. Same thing is, I also have a separate zone category for leasing, because in the US, the building code calculations are done usually by net square footage based on, inside a finished face, versus leasable square footage in a commercial building. That's defined by BOMA rules, which a lot of times goes to the outside face of the exterior walls or the center line of common walls between tenant spaces. And so you need to be able to have different zone categories based on your different functions. Now, also, I put renovation status as not to be demolished. And in other words, I only want to count the existing and the new zones, not the demolished zones. Now, then I'm going to go ahead and set up the schedule with all the different parameters that we discussed: the occupancy function, the occupant load, zone number, zone name, and on down. Now, if this is a multi-story building, you may also want to divide it up into home story and add that in, and you may even want to divide. Now, have it broken up into those different levels. Now, this one I've set the flagged condition as occupancy, because that's the primary thing I want to see is each occupancy. How many toilet fixtures do I need for that particular occupancy? And then I put sums or sigmas on all of the ones that I need counted up. I also am going to make sure that I only sort by a certain number of parameters. I don't want all of the parameters to be sorting this schedule out. Now, once you have it all set up, you can clean it up and add headers and redress everything. And as a result, you'll end up with this really handy dandy schedule that, for example, I can go through here and let's say change this space from library reading rooms to kitchen commercial, and then on the plumbing occupancy type, I'm going to say maybe I'm going to say educational facilities. And obviously that's not the correct space, but I'm just playing around and just putting different things. Now, as you can see, if I change this from different spaces, different types, as it changes, the load factor changes, and then the number of occupants changes, and the number of male and female occupants changes as well for each one. Then as I change the plumbing occupancy type, similarly, you can see the code reference changes, and that happens all the way through, shows the code requirements, but it also changes that required number of fixtures calculation for each one. So if I change this to casinos, for example, it's going to show me the code requirement, and then it's going to show the number of required water closets and so forth. And so it's a really powerful tool to be able to go ahead and calculate everything nice and quick. Now, let's say you do have a custom requirement. What you can do is you can select on the zone in the floor plan, and you can go into your zone selection settings, scroll on down to classifications and properties, and under your zones here, we can go on down, and let's say this one specific one, we need the required female water closets to be a custom value. You can actually take it off the expression and change it to a custom value, and then say, let's say we need 5. And this is where you can manually update, and when you go in, now you can see in the required number of female toilets, that's the one where it's custom, and I can even change it in the schedule, whereas I cannot change it in these here, although I think, okay, actually you can. You can change it to a custom value just by clicking within that field and changing it. So do be careful of that. Anyways, the result with all of this is that it's another powerful way for you to leverage the automations within Archicad to make your life and your job a little bit easier. It does require a good bit of setup, but it can be well worth your time to have a really good solid template with a lot of these features in. And hopefully this has been helpful for you. Again, I'm the colorblind architect doing Archicad. Peace out.